is now the PS5's time to shine. So to begin with, we have a update to the Luacore exploit from Luac0re, who says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I finally got network working at higher firmware, Luacore." So this means that the Luacore exploit now works up to the latest firmware on the PS5, 12.70. Previously, we saw this exploit using Luac0re Revenge that was released, but it only worked on older firmwares up to, I believe, 7.61. Once you got to 8.0 and higher, it turned out that PlayStation had actually stripped some functions from the PlayStation 2 emulator that's used in this exploit, which prevented it from working on those firmwares. So at that point, it seemed like this exploit might be dead in the water to be able to use it to jailbreak higher firmwares above 10.01. However, Luac0re has successfully created a workaround now, allowing this to work on the latest firmware. Now, this is a userland exploit, of course, that works up to 12.70, the latest firmware. You will not be able to jailbreak up to 12.70 with this, because the latest kernel exploit that we can chain this with is, of course, the poopsploit or net control exploit, which works up to firmware 12.0. So 12.0 is going to be the limit for now in terms of what PS5 firmwares can be jailbroken using this. And it still needs to be chained with the kernel exploit, at which point we'll probably see a full release, allowing us to jailbreak up to 12.0 if you have the game Luac0re Revenge. Now, the downside is it's very difficult to get that specific game at a reasonable price, so therefore other games will likely get added. There's Fahrenheit, which is another game that looks like it may be compatible, so hopefully we'll see other games get ported to allow this to be more accessible for anybody who wants to try and take advantage of this particular exploit method to jailbreak the PS5 up to 12.0. So anyway, that's the information we've got there with the Luacore exploit. Now, there is also another method that could re-enable the Blu-ray jailbreak up to firmware 12.0 on the PS5. A few weeks ago, we did the same thing with the PS4 with user 15432, who discovered that you could effectively re-enable the Blu-ray jailbreak, taking some of the jar files for the Blu-ray jailbreak on a vulnerable firmware and then replacing the ones on higher firmwares with those more vulnerable versions, and then that could re-enable the Blu-ray jailbreak up to firmware 13.0, even though it should have been patched in that firmware, but it does require another jailbreak to enable the FTP access to be able to replace those files. So you had to have the PlayStation Vue jailbreak on 13.0 at least once to be able to then swap out those files to enable the Blu-ray jailbreak on 13.0. It looks like the same thing could be done here with the PS5. So this was posted by EchoStretch, who initially said, "Just a heads up, before everyone starts spending money on Star Wars games, once FTP is working, we might be able to use the Luac0re PS4 trick, replacing the Blu-ray files to get BDJ. If that works, you'd only need a friend who owns the game. I have multiple PS5s, so fingers crossed." He then said that Console Hacks has tested this by taking 7.61 BDJ stack file and replacing it on a 10.01 console, and the BDJ was successful, so this should work for 12.0 once we get FTP access. So I also tested this myself. EchoStretch was kind enough to send me the 7.61 BDJ stack file, so I replaced it on my 10.01 system as well. You can do this by loading the FTP payload on your console using some other jailbreak initially, and then navigating to the system EX directory and then the app folder, and then inside there you're looking for npxs 40140, which is the title ID of the Blu-ray player. You go into that folder and then go to the CDC folder where you will find the BDJ stack file, and you simply swap that file out. You do need to enable write access for the system partitions, which you can do by right-clicking in the log and then entering a custom command and then entering mtrw and applying that command, which will remount the system partitions with write access so that you can replace the files, and then swapping out that BDJ stack file for the one from 7.61, which is of course vulnerable to the Blu-ray jailbreak, and then that should allow it to work. So when trying to load this without changing that file, it just results in a black screen. But after swapping out the file and then trying to load the Blu-ray jailbreak, the latest ISO from Victorious X, it actually loads up successfully. You can see we get the full menu showing up and we are able to use the Blu-ray jailbreak. Now, of course, it's not ready for use on higher firmwares at the moment because the Blu-ray jailbreak is still set up with the UMTX exploit, which only works up to firmware 7.61, but once the poops kernel exploit is chained with it, it could then be used to run the jailbreak all the way up to firmware 12.0. But again, the downside here is that you have to have another jailbreak that you can use to actually enable FTP access to swap out that file to make the Blu-ray jailbreak work. So you will still need another jailbreak, so up to 12.0, you would still need to wait for the Luacore exploit to get chained with the Poops kernel exploit to be able to use the Star Wars Racer Revenge game to jailbreak the console at least once up to 12.0, so that you can then enable FTP and swap out that BDJ stack file to then be able to load the Blu-ray drive exploit on that console in future on firmwares up to 12.0. But the idea is that if one person has a copy of the game, they could potentially share that with multiple people to be able to enable the Blu-ray jailbreak on those consoles, and those people could then jailbreak using a Blu-ray disc, instead of everyone having to have a separate copy of that Star Wars game. Of course, if the console gets reset, then you would likely lose that BDJ stack file and not be able to perform the jailbreak until you used another jailbreak again to be able to access FTP and swap the file out again. That is another potential downside, but at least it would be another way to get more consoles jailbroken on higher firmware. Now, moving on from that, the other big piece of news we got for the PS5, of course, was the fact that the Flow has successfully ported Linux to the PS5 and turned it into a Steam machine by getting the graphics drivers working. And you can see him running GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, the PC version, and he is running at 60 FPS at 1440p with the high ray tracing preset enabled. So the PS5 is a much more powerful system than the PS4, so running Linux and being able to run PC games and emulators is going to be so much better on the PS5. It's going to be like having a very low-end gaming PC, but that will still allow us to play games at 1080p with reasonable settings for most PC games that are out there, as well as being able to run more powerful emulators to run Switch games and PS3 games and maybe Xbox 360 games with emulators like RPCS3, Xenia, and of course Ryujinx, and other emulators for other systems that you could run on your PS5 when running Linux. So that is the exciting development here. Now, I already covered this in a dedicated video, but I wanted to just give a little bit more details in terms of what firmwares this is going to support. So of course, the Flow is saying that the ETA for a release of this is before GTA 6's launch date. So it should be out before November of this year, although I suspect it will probably be fairly soon when we will see a release of this. I'll be surprised if the Flow sits on it for a long period of time. It looks like he's pretty far into the development already, having games actually running on the console under Linux, which is fantastic. But he did say that this will only work with a full chain exploit like the Biprovisor exploit, thus only available on older firmwares, effectively suggesting that it will only work with consoles that have a hypervisor exploit. However, that may not necessarily be the case. So we have Zeko clarifying here, saying for those who are wondering about Linux on the PS5, it requires one of two things, either hypervisor patches below 3.00, so Biprovisor exploit, or KLD load. Leaked kernels are required for this, and only up to certain versions they were shared around 7.61. That's been revised to below 7.0, so 6.50 and below. So unless someone gets more leaked kernels, you can forget about Linux on later versions. Then he said he forgot it's only 6.50 and below, since 7.0 and above the method was patched. So we might be able to run Linux beyond the firmwares that have a hypervisor exploit, so 2.70 and below. We might be able to run Linux all the way up to firmware 6.50 using something like this PlayStation 5 kernel module loader. It says here, this is a kernel module loader for the PlayStation 5 that aims to provide a deeper understanding of the system's internals and assist in my research into its internals. The hypervisor remains active and untouched, but the kernel modules can run normally and in harmony with it. So using this, you could potentially get Linux running, even though you don't have a hypervisor exploit on those supported firmwares. And you can see it supports firmwares from 3.0 all the way up to 6.50. So those firmwares could also potentially run Linux once it comes out. We'll see. It might only release and support Biprovisor initially, and then maybe it can be ported over to use this, and we'll be able to run it up to 6.50. So that is the hope. And the ironic thing, of course, is that the Flow was actually demonstrating this whole Linux on PS5 on a PS5 Slim, which of course Slims came out on 7.x firmwares and above. So obviously he has some kind of other private exploit to be able to run Linux on that particular PS5, either some kind of similar workaround like KLD load that works on those higher firmwares, or maybe a hypervisor exploit of his own that works on higher firmwares to be able to run it on a Slim. But we don't know if we'll ever see a release of that. It's pretty common for exploit developers to have some kind of private exploit that they keep private so that they can continue using it on the latest firmwares without it getting patched. Now, the other big development on PS5 was a new beta release of VoidShell version 2.0 from VoidWhisper. So it has the shadow mount functionality to be able to mount your PlayStation 5 game dumps and run them on the console. It also hosts a web panel to give you useful information and functions. You can also remotely launch your games from the web panel, and it will just launch them directly on the console. There's a file manager built in, so you can move and copy files between different locations on the console, as well as being able to delete files and folders and upload files and folders to your console. And it does get very high transfer rates, especially on a wired connection, for transferring your game dumps over to the console. So that works really well too. And it has a package installer, so you can remotely install your PS4 fake packages and other package files onto the console. You have a payload manager, which allows you to auto-load payloads once VoidShell is loaded. So you can use that as your main payload loader. You can also manually inject the payloads from the web panel also, and add a custom delay of how long you want to wait for certain payloads to be loaded. You also, of course, have settings. There's lots of different settings you can customize, including Sentinel Warden. Sentinel Warden is the option to pause and unpause K-Stuff. So whenever you launch one of your game dumps, it will automatically pause K-Stuff within 10 seconds, and then it unpauses K-Stuff when you exit back out to the home page. But you have a lot of options to customize it. You can disable the notifications. You can also whitelist certain applications so K-Stuff does not get paused on those apps. And then you also have custom delays that you can add, so you can change certain games to wait longer or shorter before it disables K-Stuff when launching them. All of those features and more. VoidWhisper has already announced version 2.1 in the works, which will even have integration with Home Assistant, which is a pretty interesting concept. So if you want to use this with ETA-Hen to have all the functions of ETA-Hen and VoidShell, then you can load ETA-Hen first in your auto-load folder and then load VoidShell second. But the most stable way to run it is just with K-Stuff standalone, which you can do by downloading the K-Stuff Lite build from EchoStretch, which is a lightweight, more stable version of K-Stuff. You can download that, and then using FTP on your PS5, you can create a VoidShell folder in the data folder, and then a payloads folder inside there, and then simply copy the kstuff.elf file into that folder, at which point you can then just have VoidShell as the only payload that gets loaded in your auto-load folder, or whatever jailbreak you're using. You can just load the VoidShell payload and nothing else, and it will automatically load the Kstuff payload from that location in the data folder when it gets loaded. So Kstuff is automatically loaded by VoidShell, and then any other additional payloads that you want to auto-load can be auto-loaded from within VoidShell's own auto-loader, and that should overall increase and improve the stability of your PS5 as well when using something like VoidShell. I also noticed that the GarlicSavemgr we covered in previous videos now has support added for PS4 saves, so you can now mount, encrypt, decrypt, and resign your PS4 save files in the same way as PS5 saves, which were already previously supported. I'll leave my tutorial for the GarlicSavemgr down in the video description. So anyway, that's going to do it for this update, so hope you guys enjoyed this one or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and as always, I'll hopefully see you